IDC Radio.
בינתחומי.
106.2 FM.
הרדיו הבינתחומי.
IDC Radio. In collaboration with כל ישראל.
106.2 FM.
Counter-Terrorism Today. Up-to-date analysis with Itai Hanman.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Counter-Terrorism Today here on 106.2 FM IDC International Radio, a podcast brought to you by the ICT, the International Counter-Terrorism Institute here at the IDC. And as always, we bring on special guests, roundtables, special interviews to discuss the world of terrorism and counterterrorism and see where we are currently, examining some future trends, and trying to understand the organizational structures of many different terrorist organizations around the world and how practitioners and academics are working together to combat the scourge of terrorism. And today in studio with us, we have a very special guest. We are honored to have him here in studio with us. It is Professor Assaf Moghadam. He is the Dean of the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy here at the IDC. He is a senior researcher as well at the ICT. He is a fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, where he previously served as well as Director of Terrorism Studies at the Department of Social Sciences at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He is also a fellow at the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School and a research affiliate at the Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. START is their acronym. At the University of Maryland, he is a highly acclaimed author as well, written many books and many articles, edited other journals, and his latest book, which I highly recommend to anyone who is interested in global jihad, is titled Nexus of Global Jihad: Understanding Cooperation Among Terrorist Groups. Dean Moghadam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule in between semesters and all of the research that you are doing to join us here at the IDC studios to discuss today's episode, which is about ISIS, the structure of the organization, and where we move forward since the death of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi, their former leader. So let's start there. Maybe you can give us a little bit of background about ISIS itself for any of our audience members that just hear that name in the media and see the atrocities that they have committed, but don't necessarily know about the group that much and or its structure and its leader or former leader, Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi.
Yes. So the group, the Islamic State, also known as the Islamic State, or as ISIS and ISIL, it made a pretty dramatic expansion in 2013, 2014 in Iraq and then in Syria, but it's not a new organization. It's basically the group that has made this dramatic expansion more recently. Is a successor organization to a group that was established much earlier in the late 1990s already under different names and by a person called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. It really began as more or less of an informal network surrounding Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who later on basically developed it into a full-fledged organization. About 2003, 2004, the group became Al-Qaeda's formal affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it became a leading organization in the insurgency, the so-called Sunni insurgency that emerged in Iraq following the U.S.-led invasion in March 2003. And from then on, it took a number of different successions. The group witnessed the killing of its first founder, of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, in June 2006. He was succeeded by a pair of leaders who also found their death as a result of unnatural causes, and they in turn were again replaced by Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is perhaps who has since Zarqawi been the most notorious leader of the group, and who also helped establish a transnational insurgency surrounding the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And so the most recent iteration of the group was basically a kind of a proto-state, which held a rump territory in Syria and Iraq, had a capital in both Raqqa in Syria and then also in Mosul in Raqqa. And the rest is history, as they say.
And so Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi, what do we know about him? What was his rise through the ranks of ISIS?
Well, his rise. First of all, he comes from a religious family. He studied. He has a doctorate in Islamic study, and he comes, however, from a relatively modest background. And there's some indications that his rise was supported by certain Ba'athist elements on the part of Iraq. So he rose through the Islamic State's rank with the support of the Ba'athists, and he really is credited within the global jihadi movement for resurrecting the Caliphate, this transnational, this Islamic form of governance, which really hasn't been in place since the end of the Ottoman Empire, which was the last caliphate really that existed. And so within the global jihadi movement, he has been he has received some fairly high support.
And when looking at his rise and the idea of him implementing the caliphate, as you mentioned, it's the first time that it's existed since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. When we look at other organizations on a global level, we look specifically at Al-Qaeda as a Sunni example, and as you mentioned, sort of born out of Al-Qaeda Iraq with Zarqawi leading the charge there in the early 2000s in Iraq. Why do you think that Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi pushed forward with the idea of the caliphate, whereas Al-Qaeda looks at the caliphate as the final stage in their war of the global jihad? Yeah,
so first of all, it's good and important to highlight this issue as one of the points of divergence between Al-Qaeda and between the Islamic State. It's not the only point of divergence, but it's a very, very important one that, again, as you said, for Al-Qaeda, the caliphate had always been a very, very distant dream, something that, kind of like a utopian goal, which can be achieved, at the end of a very long process. And for the Islamic State, it was something which, let's first of all establish the caliphate and then let's expand the global jihad. I think part of it has probably to do with the idea that, as a recently independent organization, the Islamic State, after it separated itself from Al-Qaeda, probably also had to do something different. Even though, of course, I believe in the case of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they have for quite a long period kind of pursued a relatively separate, independent streak. So I'm not exactly sure when this idea to establish the caliphate, first emerged. Before even AQI decided to establish the caliphate, they also were interested in establishing like a lesser kind of statelet, and so it used to be called the Islamic State in Iraq. They had this emirate, which is like a smaller form. So you can actually say that it was a gradual process whereby the Islamic State had always wanted to kind of establish some form of state enterprise. And then, as it was becoming more and more clear that its relationship with Al-Qaeda was not one that was built to last, so to speak, they probably decided, let's take it all the way and let's become this organization that's going to reclaim and reestablish the caliphate. And part of the reasoning, I think, was probably also even from a marketing strategy, right? It's a way to separate yourself from Al-Qaeda. Again, it's not the only way to do it, but there were other ways in which the group kind of separated itself from Al-Qaeda. Tactically, of course, it used far more barbaric and heinous methods when compared with Al-Qaeda. And also another, I think, important distinction between on the tactical level is that Al-Qaeda went to had fewer compunctions to target Muslims specifically.
And as we look at the establishment of the caliphate by Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS, how was that received on a global level by rival jihadi groups? As mentioned, he was looked at, revered by other global jihadists as a whole, but how was ISIS looked at and the idea of the establishment of the caliphate looked at by the different global jihadist groups that you would consider rival groups even?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what this decision did, what the split of Al Qaeda in Iraq or ISIS did from Al Qaeda, first of all, was, and then of course the fact that they became such a huge organization and a real force to be reckoned with. It really changed the entire structure, first of all, of the global jihadi movement, because until around 2014, the global jihadi movement was really a unipolar movement, which was centralized or unified more or less by Al-Qaeda, which completely dominated the global jihad movement. It doesn't mean that, of course, any other organizations fell in place or completely agreed with Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda was the vanguard of the movement. In 2014, with the rise of the Islamic State, basically the structure of the global jihad movement changed from a unipolar to a bipolar one, with two competing camps. And so what that also meant was that a lot of organizations within the broader global jihad movement basically had to make a decision. Are we going to stick to Al-Qaeda? Are we going to move and come under the fold of the Islamic State? Or there was also a third option, which was to basically to remain kind of like a non-aligned, in the non-aligned camp, groups that didn't really go one way or the other. But basically, you saw this bifurcation of the global jihad movement into two camps. You had some groups that remained loyal to Al-Qaeda. There were other groups that switched and basically that were more aligned with Al-Qaeda before, but then switched to the Islamic State. But so this was more or less the effect.
When we look at or examine, better word to use, the death of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi, there's several very interesting points that shoot out at you when you look at it right away, specifically the resemblance to the death of bin Laden, also the capture of Saddam Hussein, very interesting similarities, specifically symbolically, and looking at the imagery that came out of those specific raids and arrests. You see in bin Laden's case, he was shriveled up. He was an old man already, not hiding in a cave, but hiding out in his compound. Didn't really look the healthiest. We saw Saddam Hussein hiding in a cave when he was captured by American forces, and Baghdadi also hiding in a cave, and the imagery shown out to the world, as well as similar imagery with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, released by the United States after his capture as well. The symbolism there rings true and very interesting to look at and examine. But another thing to look at as well is what happened once those leaders were caught or killed. Specifically in bin Laden's case, we saw sort of a degradation of the hierarchy of Al-Qaeda. What do we sort of expect now, looking at the death of Baghdadi, when it comes to the structure of ISIS?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, you talked about the symbolism, and this is very true. But I think one of the most interesting, to me at least, aspects of the killing of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi was actually the location of where he was, because he was in, if my memory serves me right, and he was found in Idlib. He was hiding in Idlib province, which traditionally was kind of an Al-Qaeda stronghold. And I think that's very telling to us, also as scholars and analysts, which is that in the terrorism world, 1 and 1 does not always equal 2. So we. So the fact that he was found in the territory of Al-Qaeda's main competitor tells us that our traditional assumptions that that these groups are entirely independent and that they're unified, and that there are clear distinctions between different organizations. It's really not something which is entirely correct. So he must have had some people who are aligned with Al-Qaeda who have probably helped him. In terms of what comes next for the jihad movement, or for Al-Qaeda in Iraq following the death of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi, I think generally speaking, I think that if I said earlier that the global jihad movement in general has kind of moved from a unipolar to a bipolar movement structure after the rise of the Islamic State, I think that in the aftermath of the killing of Baghdadi, we're probably going to see a further movement towards multipolarity. I think that we will see probably more and more power centers of the global jihad movement in general. The new the successor of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi, Abu Ibrahim al-Qurayshi, is not a very well-known figure. I mean, granted, Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi was also not an entirely well-known figure, but almost nobody has heard about the successor, and so I doubt that he's going to command legitimacy on the part of the entire group to the same extent that Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi is, simply by virtue of the fact that he was able to reestablish the Caliphate. This is something which, for his successor, is going to have a hard time, of course, doing right now. The Islamic State is at a very, very different place. In terms of kind of like general trends, I think for AQI, I think one big question that's going to keep a lot of scholars busy over the next years is what is going to be the relationship between AQI and between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. I think the relationship is going to be I think that question is going to be key. There are some analysts who believe that the chances for a merger or for some kind of collaboration between those two organizations is now on the rise, especially because the disagreement between those two organizations was in large part around personalities, not entirely, but also about personalities, and so that's been kind of taken care of. And so some argue that there is now there are growing prospects for collaboration, maybe even some kind of merger. My own personal view on this is that we will probably going to see a much more complex picture. We will probably see and again, it goes back to the idea that we don't have to see these movements, these different groups, as entirely unified and separate. There are sub-elements within these movements that might cooperate. There might be sub-elements of these two movements which are going to fight. It's probably going to differ from one geographic location to the next. But the end result, I think, is going to be greater complexity, cooperation, I think, on some level in certain geographic regions, more competition perhaps in other geographic regions, but also I think more independent jihadi hubs in a greater number of places.
And it's just mind-blowing to think about all the complexities that could go in with a potential merger between Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or further cooperation, deepening of ties between the two organizations and their umbrella organizations that are underneath them in pledging allegiance to Al-Qaeda or pledging allegiance to ISIS. Really is a scary thought a little bit to think about what they could potentially do if they were to work together. Mm-hmm. And that sort of brings to the next question as we look at academics and practitioners in the counterterrorism world. How is the death of Baghdadi viewed by the practitioners and the academics, and what sort of direction does that take them in now? Do the practitioners continue in their fight against ISIS in the same way, or is that tactically going to need to change, strategically need to change? And as academics that are researching and trying to provide insight into these organizations, the death of Baghdadi, what road does that lead the academics down now?
So I think obviously, practitioners now are kind of scrambling, first of all, to understand, who is the successor of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi, but practitioners also don't have the luxury to focus too closely on a single question, and obviously we're always overtaken by events which change the entire threat picture every day. So obviously the killing, for example, of Qasem Soleimani, or the deputy chief of the Popular Mobilization Units, those are issues that are not just important in and of themselves, but they also affect, for example, the fight against the jihad movement, because here, right now, I think that has been in part a diversion from the war against AQI. So the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and of course he's somebody that few people, especially here in our region, shed any tears over, but it does have certain costs, and one of the costs is that I think that it diverts from the fight against AQI on the part of the coalition, because now United States, for example, has to expend much greater resources, first of all, into force protection and into making sure that Iran's proxies are not managing to kick them out of Iraq. So in other words, the practitioners, on the one hand, they're scrambling, of course, to find out what is happening to AQI, who is this new successor, but they're also overtaken by events, and they need to provide new analysis and scenarios as to changing things on the ground. I think in terms of the scholars of terrorism studies, I think that the killing of Baghdadi is going to provide a lot of new material for people who study leadership decapitation, and under which conditions does leadership decapitation work. The field is not united in its assessment of the efficacy of targeted killing, and so I think that it's kind of like a case study in progress.
It's very interesting. I look forward to all the research that will come out of that, specifically, as you mentioned, in the potential of decapitation of leaders, and what does that do to an organization. And as we look at the death of Baghdadi, we spoke about how it affects counterterrorism practitioners, academics, and looking at them from a rivalry standpoint. But how does the death of Baghdadi affect the group internally as well as externally when it comes to their appeal and recruitment?
Mm-hmm. So interestingly, I think that so externally, I think in terms of the appeal of in terms of let me start maybe with recruitment. And of course, in terms of recruitment, the Islamic State, there has been, I think, a downturn in recruitment, but that has not even as much to do with the death of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi. I mean, already, ever since the Islamic State has seen its territory decrease, at its greatest expansion, it held a territory about the size of Britain, and now it's left with virtually nothing of substance, even though, of course, fighters are still there and they've melted in the territories. But so the decline in terms of the ability of the Islamic State to appeal and to draw foreign fighters, for example, to come to Iraq and Syria has already been reduced even before the killing of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi. It was a function basically of its military losses, and of course it's something which the Islamic State actually actively called upon people to remain in their home countries towards 2015, and then especially 2016 and onwards. The Islamic State made calls to its supporters no longer to come and to flock to Iraq and to Syria, but instead to remain in their home countries and to plan attacks against the enemies there. So, but I think on the other hand, I think we have to say that the global jihad movement has been very resilient. Of course, first of all, from a structural point of view, it has a very resilient structure. Part of it is because it is such a decentralized movement, but it also has been very resilient ideologically. And I think the fact that despite the greatest defeats of all, right, the crumbling of the Caliphate, we still see a lot of online activity. We haven't really seen a major decline, I think, to the best of my knowledge, in online activity of supporters of global jihadis. The fact that we still see, despite the crumbling of the Caliphate, such a lively, vivid support ideologically for the movement, just shows us how resilient an ideology it is. And so I think that we will see the global jihadi threat continuing to play a very, very important role in the foreseeable future.
I think that you're very much correct in saying that it's going to have continue into the future as we continue to examine the scenarios and all that is coming out of the death of Baghdadi and all of its abilities. And as you mentioned, the recruitment has actually been on a downturn since the territorial losses, military losses. They called for people to stay in their home countries. Having said that, and knowing that, after the death of Baghdadi, or even leading up to the death of Baghdadi, would you say ISIS still has that global reach to conduct international terrorism? And even if they do or don't, post the death of Baghdadi, is there a reorganization of the focus of where the battle needs to take place?
Mm-hmm. So I think that is speaking. You asked me earlier about practitioners, and I think that this is really another really key variable for practitioners to look into. Is I think we have seen in many ways the proliferation of and the decentralization of the threat, and I also talked earlier about Al-Qaeda having become a more multipolar movement, and so I think that we will probably see a greater number of jihadi activities in a greater number of countries. Now, I don't mean to sound too alarmist, because I'm not saying that the actual threat in each one of these different conflict theaters is going to be very potent, but we will see, I think, a lot of activity, especially in countries that where you see lack of governance structures, where you see signs of weak states or state failure. So where exactly are those places going to be? I can't tell you for sure, but I think that Afghanistan has seen some renewed activity, of course, on the part of members of the Islamic State. I think places like in Asia, like in the Philippines, for example, is something which I think is of concern. So I do think that we will see kind of a proliferating threat, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in each one of these conflict theaters we will also see a more potent threat.
That's very interesting. And before we let you go, we got to sort of take a look into the looking glass here and see the bigger picture and look out to the future and what ISIS has for us in the future. And you made mention, I think it's very interesting, I wrote it down because I figured it was going to be a point that we needed to touch on, was the fact that Soleimani's death and the effect of that has on global jihad as a whole, not only from his personal role, but also, as you mentioned, divergence of resources, focus is changing. What other types of geopolitical events can we sort of foresee in some capacity that could hinder or help ISIS regain or continue to lose?
Mm-hmm.
Are there geopolitical events that we could see out on the horizon in the sense of, I'm not saying predict the death of a Soleimani in that sense, but changing of things in the actual region? For example, Saudi-Israel relations warming up, the peace plan that's been released, Gulf states sort of turning a little more westwards and even going after terrorist activity within their own home countries. What other types of shifts in the geopolitical world can we look to see that might have a major effect on global terrorism as a whole, but specifically on ISIS?
So one of my, I have a hunch, and I've seen a few signs that the Islamic State, I think, will be trying to jump on the Israel bandwagon and increasingly rely on the Israeli issue and the Israeli-Palestinian issue as an issue that has always, since for a long time, been able to attract a lot of people to the cause. And so I think that here this peace plan proposal by Trump, and here, of course, the big question is, to which extent will there be any unilateral steps also on the part of Israel? But I think that the peace plan has, some potential actually to draw the ire of global jihadis. Not that they need additional reasons, but to draw the ire of Israel, but to serve as an excuse for jihadis to make open calls for the jihadis to support its cause. And so I can definitely see a situation where the global jihadi movement is going to evolve ideationally, for example, to become like a new champion of the Palestinian cause, for example, which in many ways it would be closing a circle, because the godfather of the global jihad, Abdullah Azzam, he had, to him, he was of Palestinian origin. He was a Jordanian of Palestinian origin, and to him the Palestinian cause had always been very, very dear to his heart. So in many ways that would be kind of like the jihadi movement would come full circle. A part of that, I think that it's really, of course, difficult to foresee the future. But I think, generally speaking, I think the types of issues that provide fodder and that are catalysts for the jihadi movement are weak states, failed states, ongoing conflict, and so in places where we will see ongoing conflict and insurgencies or incipient new conflict, I think there we can expect to see more jihadi activities. Technological changes, of course, and new innovations, like we've seen, for example, with the increasing reliance on, with the growing use of drones by terrorist groups. So these technological changes, I think, should be of great concern to us. And then I would also just mention one final issue, and that maybe is not directly an answer to your question, but one of the issues that I'm concerned about when it comes to the jihadi movement is a growing activity by organizations that may not primarily rely on violence. I think that there is a greater tendency in the jihadi movement, and by the way, not only in the jihadi movement, but even when we look at the far right, for example, a growing tendency of elements within these movements also containing, more inclusive or more seemingly inclusive and acceptable, organizations that can even, run for in political elections. We've seen this in Germany, of course, with groups like the AfD. And I think that we may see a similar trend in the jihadi context, where there will be perhaps a growing number of networks and movements that will be somewhat related to the jihadi movement, but they will come across as more acceptable for a general population, and they may hide their true intentions, and they may be smooth talkers. But that is something which to me is also a great concern.
Is that something we can look at from, or a model to examine is sort of Hezbollah, or are we talking more influential out in Western countries and having sort of social programs, grassroots organizations that would be acceptable in North America or Western Europe, and out of it rise politicians with ideology in line with jihadi? What are we speaking more specifically?
I think it's a great question, and I don't think that there is one model that that we'll necessarily see in different places. So absolutely, groups like Hezbollah, for example, or Hamas here in our context, which to me Hamas is not a global jihadi organization, but it's certainly a Sunni militant organization. These groups, they have understood a long time ago that purely relying on violence is not the best means necessarily to make political inroads. I mean, and that's why I think that in these insurgencies, I personally think of them more as insurgent organizations, because they rely on both politics and on military means at the same time. And so to me, it's a much better framework to understand these organizations as insurgencies, as opposed to simply as terrorist organizations. This is, of course, not to make them sound harmless or anything. I mean, of course, they use terrorism, they rely on terrorism, and so they are terrorist organizations, but they are also more than that. So I think that groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, we absolutely they make inroads locally by providing social services and by coming across as more legitimate organizations. But then I think another manifestation of what I'm talking about is groups like Al-Muhajirun, for example, in the UK, or these various informal networks. We've seen them. Some of them had this Sharia, 4 prefix, that were in some way connected, of course, to Al-Muhajirun and to Anjem Chowdhury, this British hate preacher. But there are a lot of informal networks, informal Salafist networks, for example, in Europe and in the Western world, which are trying to use dawah, right? They're trying to rely not on the jihad. Through, or I should say, not on the military struggle, but much more by trying to mobilize Muslims, through dawah efforts, right? By holding protests, by rallies, by distributing, copies of the Quran in pedestrian malls in Western cities, and they come across as, they want to come across as much more legitimate, as more non-threatening. But I have great doubts about their ultimate motives.
I think that's something to be very much examined looking into the future. It's a little bit of a scary thought to think that these types of ideologies could gain foothold in Western politics. I mean, you can take a look at history, always has examples throughout it where the system was used against the people, in essence. You can look at the rise of Hitler, who used democracy to rise and at the end of the day take over Germany and apply his hatred towards all peoples, and the Jews specifically, across Nazi Germany. And that is not something out of the realm of possibility that could follow in Western countries, as you mentioned, in Great Britain, where there's these informal organizations that could lead to a rise of politicians. There's no doubt about it that if you are attending these types of dawas, social services, etc., that would be provided as a child, you may grow up with a specific type of ideology, even in a Western world, and learn to apply it to the system. And that in itself can be, we could look at it as an insider threat, and it could be very dangerous to look at in the future, and something that needs to be examined both by academics and scholars, but as well from practitioners, and follow along the trends and see how that is going forward. We are coming up against the clock here, Professor Moghadam, so I'm going to have to just ask you quickly to give us your idea of what you think the future of ISIS really is. You've laid it out in many of the questions that we've asked and talked about here, specifically about their capabilities and their structure. But if you were to, in a sentence or two, look at the future of ISIS, what would you say to the world?
Well, I think that I think that we shouldn't be overly focused on Islamic State as an organization. I think that we should be concerned about the jihadi movement, in general. I think the jihadi movement is going to be around for quite a long time. Whether it's going to include the Islamic State or not is a different issue. And so I think that's the main unit of analysis, so to speak, that we should be concerned about is more the movement, the greater movement, and the various forms that it might take in the future. I should also just mention, or maybe I should close by saying that, the jihadi movement, I think we also shouldn't make it out to be more of a threat than it is, and so it is a very, very important threat. We need to pay attention to it, but we should also not exaggerate it. And I think also, as we pay attention to the jihadi threat, we should not lose sight of other very, very important threats related to terrorism, political violence, especially in the West. And here, I think that we need to pay a lot more attention to right-wing extremism, and not just to continue to focus exclusively on the threat of jihadism.
That's very interesting. We're going to have to continue to look into the future and see how your predictions come through here. Before we let you go, Professor Moghadam, maybe you can let the audience know where they can get some of your books, read some of your articles, as I am sure some light bulbs have gone on listening to this program today and are extremely interested to follow up with some of your work, especially your books.
Thank you. So yes, the best place I think to get my books is online. And Nexus of Global Jihad is my last book, my most recent book, which looks at cooperation between terrorist organizations. And then my next research article is actually going to take a step away from traditional terrorism studies. I have a forthcoming article in international security with a former student of mine, Michel Vues from Switzerland. And together we are publishing a piece which is called The Rise of Non-State Sponsors, which basically looks at how non-state actors in general have become sponsors who sponsor other proxies in their own right. And so we're very, very excited about this particular piece, and that should be coming out in the forthcoming issue of International Security.
Wow, look forward to reading that, as it does sound very interesting indeed. For all of our listeners who do have Twitter, Professor Moghadam is on Twitter as well, and make sure you give him a follow. It's at Assaf, Assaf, Moghadam, Moghadam. Give him a follow on Twitter for all the updates and latest news in counterterrorism, and especially to keep up to date with his latest articles and books. Professor Moghadam, we take the opportunity. Thank you for taking the opportunity to be here with us today in the studios of IDC Radio to talk about this very interesting subject of ISIS and the death of Abū Bakr al-Baghdadi. At the top of the show, for anyone that missed it, Professor Assaf Moghadam is the Dean of the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy here at the IDC and a senior researcher at the ICT. Dean Moghadam, thank you so much for taking the time, and we appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.